Welcome to Part 11 of Sonoma County's 12-part Insurance Requirements for Contracts training program. In this segment, we're going to discuss pollution liability insurance. Pollution liability insurance is principally covering liability that comes from environmental damage to air, land, or water. We have a number of situations in the county where such a thing could happen. Has any of you been involved with any contract that, if things went wrong, could have led to environmental damage in the county? Certainly in the water agency, construction contracts. Anything else that maybe was not a construction contract? Oh, the fire, yes, certainly the demolition, because apparently a lot of the debris was in fact toxic. Okay, we'll give some examples. So certainly almost all construction projects have a potential for a pollution exposure. Any work on water pipelines or sewer lines or underground work can lead to a potential for environmental pollution. Demolition of buildings and structures can also lead to it. In fact, there was a contract that came out from the PRMD, Permit and Resource folks, where there were some properties in the county that were poorly maintained, abandoned, had all kinds of junk and trash on them, some of that stuff potentially toxic, and they wanted to hire a demolition contractor to clear the sites. That certainly posed a potential environmental hazard, and pollution liability was required. Roofing contractors be another example. Contractors that handle, I call them the garbage contractors, but basically we're talking about contractors that handle refuse and waste disposal. I believe we have a contractor who manages our landfill and our transfer station. Those are all examples of contracts where there might be environmental hazard. Sometimes it's not a contractor. At the airport, there are certain commercial aviation businesses that handle fueling, and a fuel spill potentially can cause environmental hazard. What we've done with our construction contracts, we are aware that there are some construction projects where there's really very little exposure to environmental hazard or pollution liability. Not no exposure, but limited, very limited. So we have noticed that this is one of those instructions. It is highlighted and in red in the template. If there is a project where the engineers feel there's really no pollution exposure to that, you can delete it. And we give you that instruction. The trick is to delete it before it goes out to bid. Okay, you don't send it out to bid with the instruction in it, which has been known to happen, and you don't send it out to bid with the requirement in there if in fact it's not necessary. This instruction is both on the template and in your template assistance. Just as with professional liability insurance, pollution liability policies are not standard. So it is kind of difficult to suggest sample language or sample wording. While they generally cover the same kind of thing, they vary from pollution insurer to pollution insurer. One thing I do want to point out, pollution liability insurance is not necessarily what we want, and I'm going to use the words advisedly, from an environmental consultant. Because if an environmental consultant is mostly analyzing and giving reports and recommendations, that's a professional liability insurance exposure. But whereas a contractor is actually doing something that can cause pollution. However, nothing has a bright line in the sand, and occasionally there are situations where we have environmental contractors, but part of their evaluation actually involves digging or boring into the ground. For something like that, we might well require pollution liability insurance depending on the circumstance. Under the requirements for pollution liability, we tell you what evidence is required. Now, we always want from a contractor, if pollution liability insurance is required, additional insured status for both ongoing and completed operations. And we discussed those in the general liability section. I really don't have a sample endorsement to give you for that because those carriers have their own language or endorsement. We had talked about primary and non-contributory. The same thing applies. When there is pollution liability required, we want the contractor's pollution coverage that has made us an additional insured to be primary before our own insurance, before our own $1 million retention. Their policy comes first. We also require a subrogation waiver. If the pollution liability carrier is going to pay a pollution liability claim, we don't want them coming back at us and saying that we were in part or wholly responsible and therefore they want to recover their loss. So a subrogation waiver is included in those requirements. And here's where pollution liability insurance can be a little weird. You might remember that in the professional liability discussion, we talked about claims-made policies. Well, pollution policies are not standard. Some carriers actually write them as occurrence-based. In other words, the injury or damage has to happen during the policy period. And some companies write them as claims-made, meaning the demand for money has to be made during the policy period. So we cannot demand that pollution liability coverage be either on an occurrence or a claims-made basis. So instead, what we say is if the pollution liability is on a claims-made basis, they must show us that retroactive date that we discussed in the professional liability section. In other words, the work has to have taken place no earlier than that retroactive date. It is some of the hardest insurance to vet and review is pollution liability insurance because it's non-standard. And we strongly encourage you, if you get documentation of pollution liability insurance and it's not clear to you whether the language is acceptable, whether we can live with their documentation, that's really a time to use a help request and to loop risk management into that. Does additional insured status for pollution liability apply to both ongoing and completed operations? And the answer is yes. Supposing there is a construction project which is completed and perhaps something happens after completion. Well, for example, if it's a pipeline or a sewer project and the pipe bursts afterwards and spews toxic material, that is a claim or an injury or a damage that happens after the work is complete. Because pollution liability policies are not standard, the additional insured endorsements may not use either term, ongoing or completed. Rather, they might say something like liability arising out of your work. Okay. And if it doesn't knock out the completed operations, if it doesn't exclude it or kick it out, then by default it would be included. And that may be, so you would not get an affirmative language saying that completed operations is covered. It's simply not excluded. Again, when you get language like that, please feel free to submit it to risk management. So as we said in an earlier training part, the risk management nerds can figure out exactly what the endorsement is covering and what it's not. Excellent. That concludes Part 11 of Sonoma County's insurance training program.